And welcome back. As we mentioned prior to the commercial break, we're going to be discussing the one-year anniversary of the signing of the United Nations Convention on Anti-Corruption, UNCAC, and we're going to be also discussing the Anti-Corruption Reform Program. And with us this morning, we have a representative of the United Nations Development Program. We also have a representative from the Attorney General's Office. We have Deputy Resident Representative Karen Bernard. Good morning.
Good morning.
And we also have with us Odin Trenton from the AG's office.
Good morning. All right, so we are leading up to the one-year anniversary of the signing, of Belize's signing of the UNCAC. And it gives us, we know, a great time to be able to reflect on the significance and also some of the work that has been done so far. But I want to start off to get full clarity as to UNDP's involvement in the rollout of the UNCAC. So let's start there, Karen.
Well, UNDP's involvement is to support the country of Belize and its elected representatives' government on the UNCAC as part of the United Nations system, where one of the main reasons why the United Nations was established was to promote good governance, and addressing corruption comes under that. In the United Nations system, we have an agency that's specialized on corruption and related issues, which is the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. However, they don't have an office in country, whereas UNDP does. So we're working very closely with a number of government partners and social partners as well to support the implementation of UNCAC, and we are leveraging also expertise and support from UNODC.
Yeah. You've also provided the funding for the work that has been undertaken so far.
So far, the funding has come from UNDP for the first year of the project, but I'm happy to report that we also have funding from CARSI, from the U.S. Embassy, for the second year and third year of the project. So that is decisive because that allows us to continue. I'm sure you would understand that 1 year is not enough to make sufficient progress on this issue.
Yeah.
What are some of the developments, however? I know you mentioned that the span of a year is fairly short a time for certain developments to be made. However, where are we at this point?
Well, at this stage, Belize is in the implementation process. Now, the implementation process is an intergovernmental process, and it's a peer review process. And at this point, Belize is being reviewed by Haiti and Tuvalu. So far, we are in the first cycle, and we have submitted our self-assessment, which is a comprehensive assessment of the legal and institutional framework of Belize. And we have submitted this document. It's being reviewed now by the governmental experts of Haiti and Tuvalu. We're expecting a desk review, I believe, in December. And in January, at the end of January, we should be having our country visit. This is where there will be a physical assessment of the infrastructure, both legal and institutional, to see what recommendations can be made to strengthen our anti-corruption regimes.
The self-assessment, as I understand it, is kind of like a baseline study, where we are and how far, how much more work will need to be done to get us.
At least for this first cycle.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, tell us about the process for the self-assessment. Who was involved? Who's approved the document before it was able to be handed over for review?
Well, the document was controlled and dealt with by the Attorney General's Ministry, specifically the Office of the Solicitor General. The document was heavily done by myself and the Honorable Solicitor General, Mr. Nigel Hawke. The document contains a question flow, which details, based on the provisions of the UNCAC, which details certain questions, whether or not we have the institutional or the legislative framework or measures in place to either replicate what the provision requires, or do we have something similar to it? Then the question flows followed in a particular pattern to allow you to extract this information. There was also a portion of the self-assessment checklist that dealt heavily with technical assistance, which spoke mainly to what else would the country need to assist the country in terms of putting these things in place, especially a country like Belize with an economy in transition where you might have capacity issues or you might have a certain scarcity of financial resources, and as such, technical assistance would allow you with model legislation, draft legal advice, draft legislation, technical training as we've undergone over the past couple of months, things like that.
Now, from what has been reported in our self-assessment, how would you describe how far we are, or how much work will need to be done to be able to execute legislative changes, policy changes, and institution of human resources, especially for the UNCAC?
Well, what I can say is we do have an existing anti-corruption framework, and there are effective measures involved in this existing framework. However, it can be better. As with everything, you can have improvements. For example, we need to reform our whistleblower, or we need to put the whistleblower legislation on the table. We need to deal with maybe more tight procurement measures to ensure that we deal with government contracts in a more transparent and open manner, and there's more accountability. We also need to address issues concerning the criminalization of certain offenses from the provisions of the UNCAC into our domestic legislation. For example, the UNCAC speaks heavily about corruption in terms of bribery in the private sector as well as bribery in the public sector. Now, as it exists in Belize currently, the legal framework provides for somewhat of bribery in the public sector, but again, it does not cover a wide range of individuals, while we do not have any provisions dealing with bribery in the private sector, which is also a big role in eradicating corruption. So, we speak more about a wide approach. So the UNCAC recommends that these offenses be criminalized in your domestic legislation. So that assessment allowed us to say, okay, this is what we have, this is what we don't have, this is what we are willing to discuss, because some of the provisions of the convention are mandatory as well, and states are required to implement those.
It's interesting that you would mention the fact that corruption also exists within the private sector.
Yes.
Oftentimes, Belizeans, we get this impression that corruption is only a government thing or people in public office, as opposed to it happening in businesses and elsewhere in our society as well. It's also interesting that, as you mentioned, there doesn't seem to be any laws that apply to corruption in the private sector.
The reason is because that will require heavy consultation with the private sector, since the private sector, in terms of their control, they operate on a different system. However, it is a conversation that I think the government is willing to have, and the private sector is also willing to have, because corruption is something that affects us in every sector of society. And as such, in order to eradicate or reduce the incidences of corruption, then we need to have a wide-scale approach to eradicating corruption.
And I would also point out that there are a lot of interactions between the government and the private sector, and this is where public procurement comes in. So it wouldn't be the private sector acting alone, but these are some of the areas that need to be looked at.
And on the project board, we do have members of the private sector and the Board of Commerce. So there is an active involvement, because I do believe that the members of the different respective groups and sectors of society, the NGO community, the civil society, I think everyone understands the importance of this project, and they have all been assiduously working towards implementing a blueprint to assist us with the anti-corruption regime.
Now, as we approach the one-year anniversary, I think one of the critical questions from my point of view is understanding the political will behind, the political will that is necessary behind the full implementation. If we use the example of procurement practices, we have fairly good, if executed as is set out in the law,
in the legislative framework,
we have a fairly good mechanism in place that if it is executed properly, we shouldn't see the types of corruption that I think we have almost normalized in the country. So it shows that sometimes the legislation and the policies won't be enough to be able to prevent corruption. And, I think as Isani pointed out, the private sector has a heavy involvement. They're the ones who get the contract. So what is happening in terms of being able to change the mindset in those who are the political leaders, in understanding that this is not just about changing laws, this is about a shift in mentality as to how we will use public funds?
Well, more particularly in terms of that shift in the mentality of the public and the shift in the general mentality of the people of Belize, the preventative measures of the UNCAC speak about more dealing with the educational side of corruption. In terms of political will, that is something that I would prefer not to comment on. However, what I can comment on is that at present, the government is acting towards setting up the regime. I do believe that more importantly than even government's political will is the reporting mechanism of corruption. How secure do individuals feel about reporting corruption? Is there anonymity? Will they be protected? Can they identify corruption? So it's more of an educational campaign and more of a shift in the cultural paradigm, more of a shift in the mentality of the people, which comes from an acceptance that maybe the way we conduct business is not entirely transparent. Maybe the way that we conduct our work activities are not entirely transparent. So it calls for more of an assessment of self. Then that in itself will call the political will into place, because at the end of the day, the people are the political will.
Yes and no. We've seen different instances in the country, but Karen, you wanted to complement that.
Yes, I have a couple of comments about that. I think that what is needed on the part of leadership addressing corruption in any country is courage. And I know that in Belize we do have some leaders who have that courage and will do the right thing. But I also wanted to say that in terms of the legislation, I guess a different viewpoint from Mr. Trenton, but I believe that the legislation needs to be updated. Belize is a young country which has been in existence for 37 years. A lot of the legislation in this country is outdated and hasn't been modernized since those times. And how that affects corruption is that, for example, you may have a law against bribery, but the penalties are not established. The penalties are left at the discretion of the magistrate. So this is not meeting UNCAC standards. The penalties have to be clear, and the amount of discretion that's in the legislation itself and the application of the legislation is part of what needs to be reduced in order for corruption to be addressed.
Well, what I must say, what we were saying is, Ms. Karen, not that the legislation is up to date. What we were saying is, in the area of procurement and public procurement, where we have a up-to-date Standard Contractor General Act, which reflects generally most of the provisions that are praised in even in the document like the UNCAC. However, execution based on mandate is not necessarily, this is what people have a concern with. However, I do agree with you. For example, we have no whistleblower legislation. I think right now our drafting department is addressing the issue. However, there are other areas where we don't have any legislation, and the penalties might be too low, or the penalties might be too severe. So there's a need to balance crime and punishment. So we do have to update our legislation. However, as it stands currently, in comparison to other countries, Belize does have an existing anti-corruption framework. What we are experiencing is a problem that I like to refer to as moral hazard.
Well,
Can you explain that?
Let me just push a little bit further with that, because I think the public procurement is one of the easiest examples that people can relate to. We've done so much infrastructure work, obviously.
Yes.
If we talk about the processes that are in place, and this is where I say maybe political will is not the right choice of words, but the sensitization of the decision makers to understand that when they bypass a particular mechanism, even if it is absolutely necessary in their eyes, it undermines the purpose for having these particular mechanisms. So if public tendering is necessary, if we need full disclosure of the bids, if we need a proper justification as to why one company gets 20 out of 30 contracts, we need to know, even if it is the best possible candidate, we need to have a full explanation so we feel confident that the decisions are made in our best interest. So I go back to the question, perhaps not with the word political will, but the education to decision makers in understanding how they have a very important role in using laws that already exist.
Yes, agreed.
So what is the education that's taking place there?
I think the UNCAC also recommends a certain education process for when the recommendations are made. There's also a particular process where when those recommendations are made, then you sit down with cabinet, you sit down with the different ministries, and you go through, okay, this is the changes that are required, this is why these changes are required, and assist those ministries and entities in preparing an anti-corruption framework that is foolproof.
Let's go back to moral hazard. I'm a bit unclear, and I'm asking for a bit of an explanation as to what that point means in the context of this conversation.
In the context of this conversation, it speaks to the fact that what we have not just in Belize, but in the Caribbean generally, and in the world, and in certain regions of the world, what we have is a situation where individuals are placed in bureaucratic positions. They are placed in positions in governmental agencies or as government agents. And those individuals, even though there are checks and balances, those checks and balances are, as she said, they are not initiated. So those persons are at a position where their actions, more of a moral, more of a normlessness, right? Those persons now acting a self-interest, as opposed to acting in accordance with their mandate, responsibilities, and duties, and that is in favor of their position, acting for the people. So that is a problem of moral hazard. However, in tandem with what Ms. Bernard said, that must also feed into the sanctions that you have in place, so that the sanctions are adequate and that people have some level of fear for the sanctions that will befall them if they do not follow a particular course of action.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I think those are elements of the UNCAC that we don't discuss as often. We know how important it is to change the laws and pretty much the system that is in place to prevent.
Yes.
But there are some, I'll use the word punitive, punitive measures put in place as well, and very important recovery of assets. So
Yes.
if we find out that something was done in a corrupt practice, that
Yes.
there are mechanisms in place to retrieve. Let's talk about those.
Yes.
And how it has been successful in other jurisdictions as well.
Right. Well, I wanted to point out that under this project, we have actually, later this month, there's a workshop in Grenada
Yes.
for the region organized by UNODC, and we are sending 2 people from Belize. It's a workshop on special auditing techniques related, I believe, to asset recovery. Someone from the Financial Intelligence Unit will attend, and also from the Belize Chamber of Commerce. So this will give them very specific knowledge about how to start doing that. And also the expert from Botswana, who will be arriving here hopefully next week, is also, he's an anti-corruption expert from their Directorate on Corruption and Economic Crimes. And I believe he has some specific expertise in asset recovery. So we are certainly, as part of a lot of training
Yes.
and education and public outreach that is underway this year, there's some very specific expertise that we're sourcing for the Belizean officials.
Because it's a new area, as the UNCAC was one of the first international instruments to address the asset recovery, and it's now on the plate for the Caribbean regional entities, and the discussion is being had. And the asset recovery is one of the most important aspects of the convention, because it allows the proceeds of crime to be returned to those countries, and it allows for those funds now to be used to improve the quality of life in those particular countries. And what we must say is one of the problems in Belize, as Ms. Karen hinted to, is that we need training in this area of asset recovery, asset management, ensuring that the personnel who's dealing with it is properly trained, so that the value of the asset is maintained, so that you deal with things like third-party interests and mixed interests properly. So it's really a technical process that we are now undergoing the necessary training for it. But we are still in time in tandem with our timetable for implementation, because, as I mentioned earlier, we're in the first cycle, which deals with criminalizing and law enforcement and international cooperation, which allows us to put best practices into place, etc., from other territories in our region. I think our colleagues were on speaking about the South-South exchange with Jamaica. So that's more of our international cooperation and utilizing best practices from other territories, etc. But when we get to the second cycle of implementation, which deals with preventative measures and asset recovery, then I think we would have trained personnel within the ministry and within our private sector and our project board entities that would allow us to attack that issue head on.
From a layman's perspective, when one thinks of corruption, they think of corruption in public life.
Yes.
Such that the average person would think, okay, perhaps it begins with a government representative declaring his or her assets coming in. Well, an area representative would declare his or her assets coming into government, so that we have a basis such that when that person is no longer an area representative, maybe another assessment can be done to understand what has that individual amassed over time. Can you speak to something like that?
Well, in United Nations, we have asset declaration every year. So I have to every year declare my assets to headquarters. And if they see any differences or anything they want to know more about, they ask me questions.
Yeah.
And if there's something that's wrong with my sudden accumulation of assets, I would lose my job. So I think that's a good practice. I think it's good for public officials to every year file an asset declaration form. Now, because I work for United Nations, the funding is public resources. It comes from the taxes of people all around the world. That's why I have to be accountable for my integrity as a public officer.
Now, the South to South Exchange, we've had the opportunity to speak with a number of the representatives who attended, and one of the key points that they kept on speaking of, and it ties very closely into this issue, is the practice in Jamaica on how the Integrity Commission is formed. It seems so practical. It's like an aha moment. Like, yeah, if you're going to investigate, this makes sense rather than an appointed committee. How are these recommendations going to be used from this particular experience? In other words, they went to Jamaica, and I know we had a few comments online, why are we watching Jamaica to see anti-corruption? But they are in a particular phase in implementing their UNCAC, and that's what we're trying to learn.
Which is in advance to where Belize is at, and as such, we're just looking at their infrastructural and institutional best practices and trying to employ what we can and what suits the demographics and the framework here. However, those recommendations are compiled into a report, and that report will be presented to the focal point, and the focal point is then expected to take that report to cabinet, and then those recommendations are supposed to be discussed. And I guess that is where recommendations will come in place in terms of, do those recommendations now come into legislation, or will we take some and what will we not take? But it's an assessment, and I do believe that it is an assessment that will bear fruit. I do believe that it is an assessment that will bear fruit.
The reason I say that, and why I tied it into Isani's question, is that the Integrity Commission is the one who made the decision as to when the start of declaration assets would, well, the enforcing of the declaration of assets would commence, and also will be the ones reviewing as well. So autonomy of this particular body is very important in all the decisions that they make. Is this something that is outlined within the UNCAC itself as to composition of bodies that will kind of be watchdog in certain areas?
Indeed.
I believe there's some flexibility for every country to set up the institutions that it would need to implement the UNCAC according to its own culture and history, but there are certain principles which the UNCAC sets up.
An independence of our anti-corruption agencies and bodies are one of the focal points in the UNCAC document. It's one of the emphasis that you set up independent commissions to deal with things, independent commissions with both investigative and prosecutorial powers to allow them to escape any type of political bias or other social bias that may exist.
And I think, to be very clear, in a country like Belize, we tend to do things personality based. So if I find a person of high integrity and I want to put them in a position, I trust their decision-making power. However, in terms of a long-term vision, we don't know who's going to be in that position 5 years from now, 3 years from now, and the decisions that they're going to make. So it's almost a formalized process that has to be established. Now, let's bring it back to what happens after the independent review of the self-assessment takes place and your country visit takes place, and there's a final, I suppose, report as to where Belize is at this point. Will that be made public?
The executive summary of the report will be made public by the Secretariat, which is under the auspices of the UNODC, which is the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime.
Okay. But the actual report?
It is it is within the government's purview to decide whether to make that entire report public or whether to use a summary as well.
Okay. So looking at the approach of the 1-year anniversary, and I think I've said it many times in the show, I think people really feel hopeful. They were hopeful at the signing of the document, and almost to our detriment that we felt everything would be solved with this one signature, but that's not the case. There's a long-term process involved. So let's look at what happens following this 1-year mark, and what timelines are we really looking at to see tangible changes in the country?
Well, The country report is due, I think, 2 months after the visit, which would be sometime in March or so maybe. And then after that, those recommendations will be published, and the government is expected to make certain changes in terms of its legislative framework.
Okay.
In terms of what we are doing now, you were going to say something, Ms. Bernard?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to, I don't want to interrupt you
Yes.
before you finish, but I wanted to talk about how we're working in this project to change the culture.
Yeah.
Because the objective obviously would be that over the long term that Belizeans become more aware of corruption, more willing to take a stand against corruption. So we have been also in this first year, we've been providing training to students at the primary school level, also at the secondary and tertiary level on the issue of corruption. We've also been engaging the public through, we have an essay contest with the secondary and tertiary students in which we had 40 essays from all over the country, and we'll be announcing the winners this evening. And I was actually quite astonished at the quality of the writing. We had many, many very well written essays. And we have a jingle contest to engage musicians. This was the inspiration of Mr. Trenton on the topic of corruption. So
Sell
this,
it through music.
yeah, so this evening we'll be announcing the winner of the jingle competition,
Yeah.
and I know you're going to love the jingle. It's very catchy. I want to hear it all over the place. And it talks about corruption. I mean, we're engaging people. We're also trying to give them some information, education,
Yeah.
listen to what they have to say.
And what
the
better way than
students.
to do it through music as
Of
well?
course.
Let's go back a bit. You mentioned earlier that there isn't any legislation to protect whistleblowers at present.
At present, it's in the stage of drafting.
Okay. From a social perspective,
Yes.
as far as Belizeans are concerned, and I'm making a general assumption based on things that I've heard and things that I've seen in terms of the attitude that Belizeans have towards whistleblowers,
Yes.
there's a certain stigma such that if someone sees something and that person is bold enough to come forward and report having seen something
Yes.
that perhaps resembles corruption or is rank corruption,
Yes.
society looks at that person as, you know what, you aren't supposed to snitch, or you aren't supposed to blow the whistle on something that's happening behind the scenes.
Yes.
Does this campaign speak to a change in attitude in terms of the way we look at persons who come forward with these claims?
Well, one of the essential principles in whistleblower protection is to protect the anonymity of people making these allegations, and then also to investigate them. But Belize is a small island country of SIDS, and it's not the only country that has to deal with a lot of these issues.
Yes.
There's in fact a very good publication by UNODC on how SIDS countries deal with these issues in a country where everyone knows everyone, you don't have any anonymity. And there's model legislation that CARICOM has come out with on how to do this. And there's certain techniques and ways to adjust for that. Also, I know that one of the countries that is the peer reviewer, Tuvalu, which I've traveled to a number of times for my previous work, it's a very small country as well, so they face similar challenges, and they would be willing to share how they deal with that. So there's certainly ways of handling these type of issues. And
But
there
of
are
course, it's a cultural
examples.
issue, and it's something that, again, it goes back to self-assessment and dealing with oneself. There's no provision or point that can be in the UNCAC that can really address a change in the cultural paradigm of Belize. That is something that Belizeans have to take upon themselves. Yes,
Yeah.
in the framework of anonymity, as Ms. Karen rightly said, would allow persons to feel a bit more freely in terms of providing that information. But that is something where we can't expect an instrument to address.
Yeah.
It is something that we have to address individually. It has
Yeah.
to start at home. It has to start everywhere. It has to be how we assess things generally, how we analyze.
Increasing the value of integrity, essentially. And in certain ways, working with children and public education does help
It will help.
in being able
and
to
that is part of
understand
the
that.
preventative measures, which is one of the pillars of the UNCAC. And that is what this training that we're doing in terms of the awareness of corruption, this is what this helps with.
One of the, I've found in conversations and in attending one of the consultations, one of the very important education processes seems to be defining what the different types of corruption
Yes.
are. Why is that necessary?
I'm glad you mentioned that, Marlene, because when we were doing the training with the high school students and college and university students, we came to the realization that they need a glossary. So we prepared a small glossary
Oh.
with very simple definitions
Okay.
of different types of corruption and different terminology, so that you know, they can become familiar with that, and everybody can start to speak more knowledgeably and you know, take better action on this issue. So yes, it is important to know what the definition of corruption is, what the different types are, what is whistleblower legislation, asset recovery, etc.
Yeah, yeah. So help us demystify some of the common terms that you had to do with the high schools, because I'm sure the public is also sometimes misinformed as well with these issues.
Right, so we try to simplify it, and one of the most commonly held definitions of corruption is the use of public resources for private gain.
Okay.
So that could be, as I said, even United Nations, where we have public resources, and we have had some corruption scandals. If you throw a term at me, I'll define it for you. Based
Okay,
on
so
our
we talk about
glossary.
kickbacks.
Kickbacks is offering someone money to give you a contract.
I think from a general perspective, white-collar crimes.
White-collar crimes would be crimes committed by officials who are working in the middle management level of an office.
President offices.
Yeah. We have the distinction with bribery as well.
Bribery is offering someone money or a gift in exchange for something of economic value.
So it doesn't have to be actual funds. It could be a position. It could be.
A
You
form
know,
of enticement.
Yeah.
Okay, now this is an important point because, again, from United Nations, where I like to think we're setting a good example for all the countries in the world, and where all the countries in the world belong to United Nations, we have a policy on gifts. I'm not allowed to accept gifts. I could accept a glass of water from you or anything up to a value of about $30, but above that, I have to file
So we
out
can
a
give you a
form.
coffee
Yeah.
mug.
You could. And so I have to actually fill out a form and send it to my headquarters if I've given any gift with a value over $30. And then headquarters will tell me what to do with that. Once I was traveling in my previous job in a country called Tonga, where because of the work that I was doing with my colleague for tsunami recovery, they gave us a beautiful tapestry
Yeah.
of a kind that I had always wanted to have. And it's priceless because they hand it down at weddings and so on. They don't sell it. I was so thrilled to be given this tapestry. And then my colleague from United Nations, he immediately said to me, we're going to have to file a form into headquarters about this. So we filled out the form, and I said, and we have to estimate the value of the gift. I said, I can't really estimate the value because it's not ever sold, but
Yeah.
headquarters, they didn't really buy that. I was hoping they might let me keep it. So they said, no, you have to hand that beautiful tapestry from Tonga over to the office, and the office will display it in the office.
Yeah, yeah. You know, and actually ethical practices of journalists also, we're not supposed to receive
Yeah.
gifts as well for the same reason that it institutes a bias, perhaps that we're not conscious of as well. What about from your perspective?
Well,
What are some
I
of
do-
the necessary definitions we need?
I do believe that, well, on the point of gifts, I do believe that the public service regulation provides that government officers are only supposed to accept gifts on behalf of the government,
Yeah.
which is the same principle that United Nations would use. I think people need to be able to make the subtle distinction between what is bribery and what is not bribery, and whether is it accepting or giving, and that comes into more of a technical thing. And I think we mustn't shy away from educating people in terms of technical words and what they mean, because that is really the language of the legislative framework that we live by. So it's important that we speak about things like active and passive bribery, where one involves the official, the other being the person who's accepting, the other involves the official being the person who is inviting this offer.
Yeah.
So things like that, because then you allow persons to understand the interplay
Yeah.
of where a corrupt act happens. So anything that would improve the interplay in terms of you understanding it takes a buyer and a seller. It takes an offer and an acceptance for there to be a corrupt act. So things like that. You make people understand the distinction between those actions.
What I think it also helps with is, and that's why I was trying to get some definitions, sometimes we see things playing out in the public
Yes.
that we just know is wrong. We don't
Yeah.
know why specifically it's wrong, but
Yeah.
just something about it is not right.
Yeah.
And I think if we can allow people to become more comfortable using the different terminologies and understanding why it's wrong,
Yes.
then we will perhaps have people who will then say, I can be a whistleblower, I can provide proof in this particular case.
Absolutely, and I think generally speaking, if there's a problem, To solve a problem, you need to name the problem, and you need to be able to say, what I just saw there didn't look right, and in fact, that's embezzlement, or that's fraud.
There we go. We didn't get into those those very necessary definitions. Okay, so let's talk about your activities. We have to wrap up this segment at this point. What activities are being held to commemorate the 1-year anniversary?
There's quite a few activities, but this evening I wanted to share with our viewers that we have a big event in Belmopan at the George Price Center, which starts at 7 o'clock. And the Honorable Attorney General will be speaking there, and also the United Nations Resident Coordinator is coming in country. He'll be speaking. And one of our experts from Panama, Gerardo Noto, will be speaking as well.
As well as Senator Lena Smith.
And Senator Lena Smith is also, these are the 4 panelists. At this event, we'll be announcing the winners of our essay contest and giving the prizes and the jingle contest. And we will also have a performance of our mascots from the Training with the Children. There were 2 mascots that were also appeared in a coloring book. Their names are Spotty and Dengoso. They'll be making a brief appearance at the event tonight. This is open to the public. I would invite everyone to join us this evening.
It's in
at George Price
Belmopan.
Center. Yes.
Yeah. And you also have a symposium that will take place next week.
Yes, on December 11th.
Next week, the symposium is hosted mainly by Belize Network of NGOs and some of the other social partners. Again, the minister will be speaking. Honorable Minister Parafit will be there as well. That will be a daytime event at Biltmore on December 11th. We will have readings of some of the essays by the students who won the essays. We will have, I believe, a number of the musicians who submitted jingles maybe performing there, and discussion, of course. And we also will be at the event on December 11th unveiling the logo. We had a logo competition.
So we also had a logo competition.
Yeah.
All right. And
So this is our effort to involve the community, involve the society, get everyone feeling a part of what's happening, and getting people educated on the points we discussed, and on the need for us to all play a part in the eradication of corruption in our society.
Okay, so where do people go for more information if they want to understand what's happening in Belize as to the implementation of UNCAC?
Well, currently our advocacy strategy, which we haven't rolled out completely, involves the possible implementation of a website. However, in terms of general knowledge on the issue of corruption and the UNCAC as a document and any follow-up documents, people can visit the UNODC website and just click on corruption, and you'll find lots of information on the UNCAC documents, legislative guidelines, etc. So you can educate yourself, and you can put those persons who are in positions of responsibility to act on your behalf.
If I can say, this evening, the event in Belmopan will be live streaming that on the UNDP Facebook page, UNDP Belize, for anyone who may not want to travel to Belmopan.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming in and talking to us about what has been taking place and what we hope to be able to achieve as we continue with the implementation of the UNCAC. Thank you. We're going to go ahead and take a break. And when we come back, we're going to be talking about how to keep yourselves and your homes and the rest of your property safe during the Christmas season. That's coming up after the break.